Romantic love is mankind's most talked about, written about, painted about, and thought about subject matter. It is clear to see people love love. So it is surprising that we still struggle so much with romantic relationships. After thousands of years of romantic encounters and millions of grand love stories told, one would think that by 2021, we would have fast-tracked the process of finding the love of our lives. So, why is love so hard to understand? Have you ever been on a first date or in a new relationship where you were so taken by the person that you find yourself thinking or saying things like, "I feel we were destined to be together," or "It's fate that we met. I think she might be the one. He is my soulmate." People talk about love as if it is a mystical force, completely removed from any rational thought, an untouchable feeling that cannot be described or ignored. These beliefs are all the influence of Romanticism, the ideology of a 19th century cultural movement. Romanticism has completely shaped our current understanding of love and romantic relationships. When it comes to love, we are still living in the Romantic era. And when you see this, it becomes no surprise that people are struggling in romantic relationships, considering every piece of romance media we consume falls under the philosophy of this overtly idealistic era.
Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for.
If we're going to understand how Romanticism has changed our current culture, we need to get a better understanding of what the movement believed in. Romanticism, or the Romantic era, was a late 18th to 19th century cultural movement that originated in Europe. Romanticism was characterized by its emphasis on artistic individualism and expressive emotions. The movement was widespread and influenced many sectors of life, including art, literature, architecture, music, and intellectual thought. Romanticism drew much of its ideology from the medieval period. Both eras had a strong interest in exploring the spiritual and emotional side of human existence. Romanticism was seen as a reaction to the neoclassical movement, the Industrial Revolution, and to the Enlightenment, all of which were flourishing during the time. Romantic thought falls into direct opposition of the ideals of Enlightenment thinkers. While the Enlightenment strived to solve societal problems through the use of reason, the scientific method, and logical progress, the Romantics countered this by focusing on the beauty of nature. Romantics believed that artistic expression, personal intuition, spiritual guidance, and dreams were the answer to all of life's hardest problems. When it comes to how Romanticism looks at love and romantic relationships, we can see Romantics believe that intense, passionate, sexual feelings should be at the core of any happy love relationship. Romantics fused together marriage, which was seen as a rather practical and strategic custom for the time, with an emotionally intense romance. Together, Romantics set forth the cornerstone of every romantic story told thereafter, a lifelong, ever-passionate union of love, or more commonly known today as happily ever after.
But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun.
Now, this isn't to say that romance stories did not exist before the Romantic era. Love stories have been around since the start of language. However, the Romantic era was one of the first times that love relationships were presented in the idealized and romanticized way that we constantly see them now. If we look back before the Romantic era, we will find what is widely regarded as the most influential Western love story of all time, William Shakespeare's iconic tragedy, Romeo and Juliet. But did you know that Romeo and Juliet was not intended to be seen as this idealized story of wondrous, passionate, and inevitably tragic love? Shakespeare had written it to be a critique of society, and was intended to be a warning for the dangers of young, lustful, and idealistic love, the exact opposite of what Romantics believed to be fundamental to a romantic relationship. Romanticism corrupted Romeo and Juliet and reimagined it as the ultimate love story. And we can still see Romeo and Juliet this way today. It isn't hard to find the story's influence in love media. There have been endless retellings of the play, from pure adaptations like the famous 1968 release, Baz Luhrmann's 1995 modernization, or stories like Twilight, which take immense inspiration from the play. Even in our year of 2021, we are still using Romeo and Juliet as the ideal romantic example. Famous singer-songwriter Taylor Swift released a re-recording of her 2008 hit Love Story, the plot of which is taken directly from Romeo and Juliet, and it yet again reached the top of the charts, making it just another example of how Romanticism's interpretation of this 400-year-old story still directly influences our romantic ideals.
Death cannot stop true love. All it can do is delay it for a while.
Though the movement ended almost 150 years ago, when it comes to how we approach love relationships, we are still living in the Romantic era. To understand the impact Romanticism has had on our modern media, we have to look at the fundamental components of a Romanticism love story, and how these components have turned into relationship myths in real life.
But our love is like the wind. I can't see it, but I can feel it.
First and foremost, Romantics believed that how a person feels towards their love interest is far more important than any rationality or practical reasoning. Similar to how Romanticism believed in personal intuition, love in modern media is based on this abstract idea of a feeling. The protagonist of any love story knows that they are in love because they get an intense feeling. Often, this extreme passion is contrasted with a more stable compassion they felt for a different partner in the same story. What Romanticism gets wrong is that in real life, this feeling is not actually the feeling of love. The sparks or the butterflies that a person gets at the beginning of a relationship or flirtation are not in fact feelings of potential love, like Romanticism has made us believe, but are in fact feelings of a different biological phenomenon, limerence. Limerence is an involuntary interpersonal state that involves an acute longing for emotional reciprocation, obsessive-compulsive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and emotional dependence on another person. Limerence is the feeling that makes most people say, "I cannot stop thinking about them," or "she is the center of my world." People experiencing limerence talk about their relationship like it's a drug, as if they are intoxicated by a person. Sadly, popular romance stories often depict limerence as love, leading people to believe that feelings associated with romance and limerence are in fact feelings of love in their real romantic experiences. Romance is one of the only facets of modern society that is still favorably looked at through this emotionally driven and often irrational lens. Very few people would tell you to buy a car that is out of your price range because it's what your heart wants you to do, but every movie, TV show, and song tells you to follow your heart in decisions of love and relationships.
I came here tonight because when you realize you want to spend the rest of your life with somebody, you want the rest of your life to start as soon as possible.
Almost every major romance story ends when the couple gets together, signaling to the audience that the most difficult part, and in a less obvious way, the most significant part of any romantic relationship is getting together. Romantic stories believe that the trials and tribulations of the relationship should only present themselves at the beginning. Once the couple has gotten together, all of these issues should cease to exist because the love was conquered. Every Disney love story, up until the last decade, followed this trope, influencing people from a very young age to believe in the narrative of happily ever after. Romance stories see love as something that is relatively stagnant. Once the happily ever after comes, it will be smooth sailing forever after, the love never changing, never lessening, nor growing. The most fundamental aspect of the romance genre is the happily ever after. Ask any romance novelist, and they will tell you that a book cannot even be considered a romance without it. Now, this is clearly not how real romances work, though our brains and our social structures may have you believe that this should be the case. We still use romance story tropes as the architecture of real relationship milestones. The equivalent to the happily ever after in Western society is the wedding. A wedding, for most couples, is seen as the most important day of not only their relationship, but of their lives. And there is an entire industry devoted to upholding that narrative.
You should be kissed and often, and by someone who knows how.
Well, I suppose you think you're the proper person.
I might be.
Sex and love are now one and the same. Romanticism promoted passionate sex to being the ultimate expression of love. The template for this idea is that the person who fulfills you the most sexually must be the person made for you, and then, in turn, can spend the rest of your life with. Romanticism demonizes unsatisfactory sex, infrequent sex, and adultery. Love affairs are seen as the death sentence to romantics, because passion in the bedroom and profound love are always connected. Romanticism also promotes sex and sexual desire as love. This again goes back to the idea of limerence, infatuation, and the feeling being misconstructed in these stories as love. And this concept is only getting stronger, as sex and sexualization have become more widely accepted and destigmatized. Mainstream romance media has begun to explore topics like kink, fantasy, and sex's innate connection to love. Within the last decade, there have been a number of films and books released that deal with sex and love directly or through subversive storytelling. 50 Shades of Grey tackles kink in relation to love. Christian Grey, a man who seems to have it all, takes on a borderline animalistic infatuation with the young and naive Anastasia. Sadly, these sex-focused movies and literature often paint abusive and toxic relationships as loving ones, and the romance genre has a long history of promoting sexual violence as love. Bodice rippers were a subgenre of romance novels popular in the 1970s. Often seen as anti-feminist to many critics, the bodice ripper was typically a historical or gothic romance that featured scenes in which the heroine is subjected to sexual violence. Promoting toxic and abusive relationships has even been criticized in children's media. Disney's Star Wars sequel trilogy was deeply criticized for promoting an unhealthy romance between the series' first female protagonist and its emotionally manipulative villain. It isn't hard to understand that for adolescents, the target demographic of Star Wars, to see their hero fall for a man who tortured her and murdered her friends could send an unhelpful message. The correlation of sex and love, though rooted in reality, can lead to harmful depictions of loving relationships. It can be entertaining to watch tumultuous on-screen relationships, but it's time to start questioning whether these people are in love at all or are just having passionate sex.
They say when you meet the love of your life, time stops. And that's true.
One of the most troubling concepts presented in romance stories is the idea that there is only one person out there for you. And this idea can be depicted in a variety of packages, whether they are your soulmate, the one, the love of your life, and in the greatest love stories, all three. Movies present meeting a romantic partner as something of spiritual destiny. A grand occurrence, something people only get once in their lives. Often this grand occurrence takes place through a meet-cute or a montage of amazing instances, where the pair are seemingly connected, constantly running into one another. Their lives seem unusually linked. This major genre trope of seeing the person the protagonist is infatuated with everywhere perpetrates a dangerous phenomena of seeing signs. The idea that the universe will grant you with signs, these constant reminders that will always point you to the right person. Romanticism believed in cosmic styles of intuition and in entrusting spiritual signals. Romantics believed that two people are destined for each other and that they will find each other if they follow spiritual guidance.
What happens if you fall in love?
You don't believe that, do you?
What? It's love, it's not Santa Claus.
So, what is the alternative for romanticism in love? Jane Austen, the most prominent romance novelist of all time and a leader in literary thought during the Romantic era, poses this exact question in her work, Sense and Sensibility, in which sisters Marianne and Eleanor are stand-ins for the rivaling artistic movements of the time, Romanticism and the Neoclassical era. Marianne is an emotional, creative, and idealistic young girl, and is the representation of Romanticism. Contrasted to Marianne is her older sister Eleanor, a quiet and pragmatic realist, representing all the values pushed by the Neoclassical and Enlightenment era. Austen pins the two girls' ideologies against one another as they go through trials of the heart and mind. Sadly, Austen doesn't provide us with a solid preference for one movement over the other, and she still ends this critical novel with the classic romance ending, where both sisters are happily married. But I think it wouldn't hurt if we took a page out of the Neoclassical Handbook in 2021 to approach romantic relationships. If we look at the scientific basis for love, as one would in the Enlightenment, we can find that there is a groundwork set for what it means to be in a stable and happy relationship scientifically. The triangular theory of love is a commonly accepted psychological theory developed by psychologist Robert Sternberg. The triangular theory of love centers around the concept that romantic relationships and love can be understood by three core principles: intimacy, passion, and commitment, and the connection that these factors have with one another. Intimacy refers to the feelings of closeness, connection, and bond in a loving relationship. Passion refers to the drive that leads to romance, physical attraction, and sexual consummation in loving relationships. Commitment refers to, in the short term, the decision that one makes to love another person, and in the long term, one's commitment to maintaining that love. Love stories today tend to only focus on incomplete versions of love relationships. Often Romanticism only focuses on romantic love, which the theory describes as a love with intimacy and passion that lacks commitment. Partners in this type of relationship often have deep conversations, sexual passion, and intense affection, but lack any long-term commitment or future plans. Even more troubling is that love stories will often push infatuation, a love in which there is only passion, as the ultimate form of love, because there is no practical thinking behind it. It's all raw desire. According to the theory, a complete or consummate love must be made up of all three components. Couples who experience this kind of love have great sex several years into their relationship. They cannot imagine themselves with anyone else, they cannot see themselves truly happy without their partners, and they manage to overcome differences and face stressors together. Now, there are plenty of examples of the romance genre rejecting Romanticism's tropes and ending the story with the characters not together. But in the grand scheme of the genre, these anti-romances would be few and far between, though the tide has been shifting within the last decade. As Hallmark movies and trashy reality TV shows about finding love still dominate in popularity, there has been a shift in the literary and film industries to depict more realistic and often anti-romanticism love stories. Romance media might be entering into a post-romantic era. Movies that highlight the tricky situations and evolving emotions of intimate relationships have received immense positive attention from audiences and critics alike. Movies like Marriage Story, Carol, and Moonlight all tackle romance from a much more authentic perspective than we have seen in the majority of past romance media. But the fairy tale myth persists, both on our screens and in our hearts.